couple of days ago, and maybe one of the questions that we have to raise at this juncture is, where is this continent heading? What kind of an agenda do we need right now, and what should be the priority, so to speak? With us this evening is a distinguished panel. With us is Dr. Nabil Zaki, who is a veteran journalist. Always a pleasure to have you with us. With us also Dr. Cherif, Amir, a political analyst and a professor at the University of Paris. A pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Without going into the agenda of the summit, maybe one of the things we should be asking ourselves, what does this continent need? And whenever I talk about our continent, I always say, until when will we be considered one of the richest continents when it comes to natural resources, when it comes to human resources, yet we continue to be the poorest continent worldwide? Until when are we going to continue this scenario, so to speak?
Until the Africans know more than what is going on now, how to deal with economic affairs, because they take loans from the Western countries, for example, and they go deep more and more day after day, taking more loans. And at the same time, this riches, the sources of Africa go there, to Europe, for example, but in one direction. The other direction receive little sum of money. At the same time, there is corruption, because the rulers of some countries give concessions and licenses to their friends from the businessmen. And those do not try at least to obtain technology. That's why, till now, the Africans is far away from technology. To make technology take roots in their economy. This is the problem.
Our fault, or is it that we're not given a chance to develop? We're not helped to develop?
Both, because first of all, the rulers are responsible there in many African countries, because they prefer to deal with businessmen from there among their friends. For example, to give this businessman the license to exploit this mine resources. So this one will export all the resources abroad. The money will come, most of it will go to his pocket and to his friends, and to the ruler himself, who gave him originally the license or the privilege or the concession. So the problem is that the profits will go to some few people. At the same time, you can consider that, as you said, the problem is still Africa, the richest continent in the world, and at the same time the poorest continent in the world. Yeah, this is a real problem, yeah, because till now exploitation is prevailing everywhere. Exploitation. And even agriculture was neglected. Why? Because some Westerners go there, neglect or persuade the peasants to leave their land to work in mines. And even the result, you can notice that the result is that even the agrarian product is less than before. This is a real tragedy.
Where do you see this continent heading? We are holding a lot of meetings. We have a lot of conflicts. This continent is being marred with a lot of terrorism. Can we consolidate efforts to have one agenda? Will we be allowed to do this?
Look, I call it the spirit of history in this continent, the moment of truth, because the new generation in Africa got a clear message from Europe, which was always the dream, a message that they're not welcome anymore. There is no immigration now allowed in Europe like it was before. So usually the exploitation was taking place in the continent. Europe needed people to work, so the people went there to work in every type of jobs there, the cheapest ones, and it was an exchange like that. We take the people, the demography in Europe, and then we'll exploit, we take the materials from Africa. Now it's not the same story anymore. The European populist movements now are refusing, as we are seeing, they're rejecting them even to cross the borders through the boats, and they call it illegal immigration. So the people of this continent, the leaders now, know that they have a burden, they have to feed these people. They won't go anywhere anymore. So this is the moment of truth. They have to start building these kind of projects inside their own countries. In the same time, Europe's influence is fading because of the Chinese and the Russian presence there. The Chinese are also taking their part in they're not taking only the materials as the Europeans did. They're constructing some factories there, inaugurating some businesses there, infiltrating by all means the political sphere there. So as the Russians. I heard, I read a report yesterday. It was very intriguing because it said that there was a message from Macron that was passed to the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, that they should back off from Central Africa because this is a French territory. Because the Russians are present there and they're trying to have businesses there.
So we still have this concept that this is a territory, a colony.
Of course. So the big problem now is that the new generation has nowhere to go. So as you said, there's terrorism, there is poverty, and there is no education. And the only thing that we are facing now is that the people that are growing in this continent, one day we'll have to find them jobs inside the continent, food to eat, hospitals to get treatment, and education.
A life.
Of course, as human beings. So this is a new era for this continent.
Dr. Nabil, do you see that this summit, I believe it was the 11th Extraordinary Summit, did it tackle the pressing issues?
Did what?
Did it tackle the pressing issues that we're actually facing to lead to the sustainable development that we're all aspiring to achieve in this continent?
I believe that the main point, which is useful for the Africans, the main aim, the main object is how to build the infrastructure in many African countries. Second, how to give assistance without conditions, without political conditions.
Who gives assistance? The West giving?
For example, while China till now succeeded in many African countries, because they do this. They give assistance, but without conditions.
But it has markets.
Why not? This is beneficial for the African country.
Win-win relation.
Why not?
It's a win-win situation.
For example, you know, in Africa there are a lot of wealth, big wealth.
Yes.
Diamonds, copper, cobalt,
Uranium.
many resources, wealth. So I believe that the problem now in Africa, how to build the countries without exploitation from the West, without loans which is a real burden for many African countries. For example, some African countries exported a lot of petrol or a lot of diamonds or copper. The question is, what did they receive in return? If you discuss this, if you study this, you will discover that they received the minimum. If you compare what went out and what went in. This is the real problem. At the same time, some African countries are suffering from terrorism, like Nigeria. And till now, those terrorists are active. At the same time, you can conclude that some Western countries, like the United States, try to pretend that they are helping such countries against terrorism, but they did not, in fact. And that's why the terrorist movement there are expanding and going to Chad and Mali and so spreading here and there. At the same time, Africa is now, unfortunately, started to be a continent which exports human beings to be drowned in the Mediterranean during this illegal immigration. It's another tragedy for the Africans. So what? I believe that till this moment, the Africans must depend, if you want to solve the African problem, to depend more upon themselves, to try to learn. Here, this matter about the education is very important. To learn from their own experience how to develop their economy, how to depend upon themselves, and if they take some help or assistance from the West, according to their own interests and their own conditions. That's the only way.
When we talk about that we use Africa cooperation to rebuild our countries or our continent, here the question is, do we have the political will? And another question would be, can you do this so long as there are foreign pockets in the continent? Let us not forget you have boiling points. Let us not turn a blind eye as to why we have the boiling points. Most of the movements, the alleged movements against the country's regimes, for example, happen to be not from the country. I mean, they're outsiders that have been planted to cause this chaos, so to speak. So do we have the fertile ground to get our act together and rebuild?
Well, I will give you concrete examples. I used to live in France, and you know the close relations between the French and the African continent.
Yes.
The people used to call a country like Gabon, they used to call it a gas station, a French gas station, literally. And I asked why. He said it's full of oil, and you just can take the oil as you like and send it back to France. And the president, his name is Ali Bongo. His father was the president, and then when his father died, the French told him, you can take over afterwards, but we will keep you there, and no opposition, and then the gas is ours. So this was amazing that we call a country a gas station because it's just useful for that. This is an example. The same thing for a country like in Niger. Niger is full of uranium. We know that no one can touch it because it's for the French military there. It's for the purpose of use. And there is a third problem. Also, we have Algeria. We didn't talk about North Africa. A country like Algeria is rich with oil, but still living in this conflict inside
Libya.
And Libya.
Yeah, the conference last week.
Of course.
How was the international representation in that conference?
And you know why this conference took place? Because the first time Europeans sensed that they are suffering from the immigration. So they said, okay, we want to settle things.
But we don't have anything tangible coming out of this conflict, so long as there are foreign entities on ground meddling and dividing the rank and file.
And I said, if you want to find a solution for the Libyan conflict, for example, you have to do two things, and it could be done in a matter of weeks. Stop the funding of money and the funding of weapons, and that's it. The factions working for outside forces.
Dr. Cherif, have we not been calling upon this? I mean, hasn't Egypt been one of the countries calling upon those who harbor, who fund, who train, who provide the safe haven for terrorism and terrorist organization? I mean, we're suffering. I mean, we're having a huge battle with that here.
To talk about it, and we were the first to introduce General Khalifa Haftar.
But is it being taken seriously?
Now, when Italy got a populist government, speaking from the hearts of the people of Italy, they are suffering of the immigration. They said, let's listen to Egypt. We want back for the kneel in front of Erdogan and the blackmailing of this refugees problems. And they started talking with us and talking with Khalifa Haftar. And this is a success. And I think that we will have more and more success because the Europeans now, especially the European Union, is having extreme internal problems, economically, socially. You have the heart of Europe, which is Poland and the Central European countries, refusing to have any refugees within their borders.
I understand that, but some critics would say it is in the interest of the West that things remain as are in the continent. For a very simple reason. The continent is a good source of energy, different forms of energy for their development. It's a good food basket,
of course,
for their populace. So if we are allowed to flourish and take matters into our hand, as you are recommending or suggesting, then people would not be allowed to come in and, as the gentleman was just saying, Gabon is the gas station of France. It would not be the gas station of France. It would be the gas station of this continent. Isn't that the case? So would we be allowed to actually reach a stage whereby we take the reins into our own hands?
Once the European power will fade, and it's fading, we're seeing it in front of China and Russia. It's fading. China is a giant, economic giant. And I think that Europeans need to recognize that, and they will recognize it. Look what's taking place in a country like France, with all the demonstrations taking place. So I think that therefore, the first time, the people in Europe are not that powerful as they were. And I think that the new governments will say, it's time to close our borders and keep in our own business. We will mind of our own.
Close our borders, I agree with you. Keep in our business, this is a question to be raised. Will they close the borders and stick to their own business?
No.
And close the gas station in Gabon?
I believe if you want to discuss the tragedy of Africa, you have to start by trying at least to call for an African revival. How? Many people in Africa are not well aware that this continent had a great heritage of culture and civilization. Before the Americans go there to take their slaves from Africa, you have in Africa a real rich heritage, cultural heritage. Even if you take a look to their legends, very significant, very instructive, ethical. So, in this case, if there is a real African revival, let us hope that they will forget tribalism. This backward phenomena which is hindering the progress of Africa. At the same time, I have to tell you that Egypt can play a very important role in this field. How? I want to remind you, if you remember, the Bandung Conference in the year 1955. What was the first outcome of that conference? The liberation of 32 African countries in Africa. Good. So what is the rule which will I visit, for example, Congo Brazzaville once, and I met the president during that time, Marianne Guabi. The first question he asked me, how is Mohammed Faik? You know him? He is the man who trained me. So such relations with Africa was neglected for years from our side. Also, our relations with even the Arab countries in the north of Africa.
We deviated for a while, yes.
Yeah. But I must tell you here, I came since 2 days from Morocco. There is a very positive step. The initiative of the King of Morocco to solve all the problems with Algeria. He made this offer to the Algerians. Please come, negotiate, and we are ready to solve all our problems since years, since decades. The differences between Algeria and Morocco was bad. And the reflection in Africa was passive, was not good. Because I must say that not only Egypt, but Algeria and Morocco played previously a very important role in Africa, helped some African countries in many domains. So I believe that that summit, if we take care to follow the recommendations, the decisions, and so on, in particular in helping some African countries in combating terrorism and trying to rebuild their economies, it will be helpful. As Egypt did before. That's what I hope.
The fact that Morocco is actually taking the initiative to present a resolution to the conflict, do you think there's a success factor because it's an internal issue, it's being resolved internally rather than...
It depends.
Or will it be allowed to continue to be
positive
internal
reaction from Algeria. Till now, they kept silent. They didn't comment. I hope that the reaction will be positive because it will change the situation in the north of Africa, especially among two important Arab countries. And it will have another positive reflection in Libya. Because Egypt from one side, Morocco and Algeria from the other side can help to contain the situation in Libya and support the Libyan unified army. That's what I hope.
Whenever we talk about Western interference, we would have to say the U.S. role here, it being the superpower, so to speak. And how do you see the presence of the United States in the conflict, or in the continent and in certain conflicts? Because one of the things that was noticeable is the lack of U.S. presence in the last week in Palermo, in the Libyan summit. Is this the fact that the United States, that Trump sees that his concentration should be on local matters, or is it because they do not want to contribute to solving the conflicts? How do you read the American involvement in the continent right now?
Well, the American involvement is just in the African. It was the force that was made for I don't know, was for combating terrorism or peacekeeping, we don't know yet. But still, let's say that the Americans know, for example, that there is still the colonial tradition that Africa was always a safe haven for the Europeans. So they never really tried to go in there, except at the time of Bill Clinton. They started inaugurating some projects there, but the United States of America is taking us steps aside. As you see, they are interested in the oil in the Middle East, and the Europeans are interested in the materials in the continent of in Africa. And Asia is just a mixture between...
Interested in the market.
Yeah, but they cannot defy countries like Russia and China now. So they know that they are distributing between them these materials. But let's say that whenever, for example, we will see the intervention of the Russians or the Chinese in Africa, and there is a competition with the Europeans, the Americans, of course, they will take side with the Europeans against them. But they are keeping silent in all the problems in this continent. They just, maybe they intervened between the creation of South Sudan at that time. And you see, it wasn't really a success. We all know about the greatest failure, Somalia, when they had the intervention there. And it ended up that it's a failed state now, as they had the intervention in Afghanistan. It's a failed state. In Iraq, they had the same problem. So I think that in Africa, they have this conception that the Europeans are taking care of it. They are concentrating more on the Middle East. But let's not forget that once, if there will be an American administration interested in Africa, they will set a foot there and they will start competing with the other countries. But maybe the Trump administration is trying to let the Europeans deal with the problems of Africa by their own, because they know that Europeans now are suffering because of this continent and the immigration and all the problems that they are having. And maybe this is the same mentality that the Americans had during the First World War and the Second World War, when they didn't intervene from the beginning and let the Europeans settle with Germany, Nazi Germany, until they all failed and then they stepped in. So maybe they're waiting that Europe will be exhausted at a certain time and then they will step in. Let's not forget that President Macron of France is now speaking about creation of European army, which is aside the American umbrella, which is NATO. So that means they are sensing that they are fragile from the inside and they cannot trust that. So the Americans are leaving them with the problems of the refugees, the economic problems inside, the problems of the ethnic and religious communities within Europe. They are not integrated, so they're leaving them maybe to just be exhausted, and once they will step in.
How can Egypt play, as you were saying, in the past we ignored our role in the continent. How can we sort of enhance our role in the coming stage? I know that President Sisi, since he came to office, he has sort of reopened the channels of communication and cooperation with Africa. But how can we strengthen our presence in the continent to ensure that we have more intra-African cooperation and development? Because if we rely on the outside, then definitely there will be a very heavy bill to pay, the conditions that you were talking about. How can we take a more pivotal role?
We have now a golden chance to do what you are hoping. Because don't forget that we will be the head of the African Federation within a very short time.
Yes.
So in this case, if you are the head of the Africans,
what should be our priority? If we're to put an agenda, a concrete agenda, and maybe with more tangible or measurable
outcomes, so to speak, that we want to do A, B, and C,
Yeah.
and want to see it.
To put the basis for a real economic development, sustained economic development. Making the rules. For example, no loans with conditions which will destroy the economy of a certain African country.
Yes.
Second, the infrastructure to be rebuilt. No conditions for any assistance. Independence. A free will for every African country. You can coordinate your efforts. That's why I talked now about Algeria and Morocco with these two countries to help us. At the same time, you can encourage African investment in Egypt and Egyptian investment in other Arab, African countries. At the same time, you have the chance to demand from your African country, your African friends, to abolish U.S. American bases, which no less than 20 American military bases in many African countries. And no need for American troops, because there are hundreds of American troops in some African countries. That's what I mean by encouraging African countries to be more independent, more sovereign, more enjoying free will, and to demand, and you have the right as the head of the African Federation, to make the basis for what we can call a real trade with the other countries of the world. What I mean by a real trade, you can say that on the same level, not as an inferior to the others.
Yes.
You understand what I mean?
Equal opportunities.
Equal opportunity. At the same time, to try to preserve the wealth of such African countries, not to be stolen, or, because I must tell you something, you heard about these money havens in the Atlantic there, near the islands in the west. Those capitalists in Africa, or let us say thieves and robbers, they take the money not to be reinvested in their countries, no, to go to these money havens, to disappear there,
Yes.
to make wealth for those businessmen who are the friends, as I told you before, of some corrupted rulers. That's the problem. Anyway, all what I mean is to encourage, first of all, African countries to solve any problems among them with peaceful means. No border disputes. No tribal clashes. At the same time, to help them to combat terrorism and to rebuild what we call here in Egypt the national state, the African national state. So we can help in the very near future African countries in many domains, economy, militarily, in technology if we can, investments, cooperation in even cultural cooperation, not only economic cooperation. Every domain we will have a real chance to lead Africa to a better future, at least.
Can Egypt play a pivotal role in the creation of the African national state, as Dr. Nabil was saying? And how do you feel about that help should be given without conditions? Do international organizations give you donations without conditions?
We have no choice but to collaborate within the continent each other. We have neglected, yes, Africa, and we paid the price. We are paying the price today. And President Sisi said it openly. What's happening with Ethiopia is because we have neglected for years the relations with these people. Yeah. So I think it will take time to rebuild confidence that Egypt is willing to help and to ask also for help on equal levels, that we're not seeing ourselves superior or something like that. We should know now that we have the materials inside our continent. We can call it our backyard. The water, the minerals, everything. And these young people in Africa, they would love to come to Egypt and learn here, if they have the opportunity also in the universities. We have formed through history many of the military leaders in Africa in our prestigious military academy, which is the most prestigious in the Middle East. And we have formed many of the African statesmen who went back to their countries and contributed. So I think why not we can repeat the history. But still, we have to have a new language with them to divert their attention from Europe, because they know that Europe is not Europe of yesterday. And we are all in the same continent. We have one future. We have one destiny. We have to work together. But it depends on the leaders. That's why I think that President Sisi is doing a great job by talking to the leaders of these countries. Head-to-head relationships, even with Ethiopians. This exchange is helping a lot because the bridges were broken. For example, look at a country like South Africa. After the apartheid, it was leading country. Now they are living in very difficult problems in the inside. It went to the extent that the Russian President Vladimir Putin opened the immigration for the white families to come to Russia, and this was in the BRICS. For example, the BRICS, why we're not having the same thing within Africa between some countries, economic exchange between Egypt, Nigeria.
Intra-Africa trade is very weak, even though the concept of a common market was actually born in this continent.
This is our daily problem now with Ethiopia. Once they needed economic development, they didn't find anyone to help inside the continent, so they went to the outside. They got Israeli, Qatari, Turkish, American, Italian, Chinese help from everyone.
And now the Israelis strike to infiltrate.
The Israelis, yes.
Many
Uganda is having excellent relations with Israel now. Economic and military cooperation. All that we have to find. It's in our hands. This we cannot blame anyone else but ourselves. And we have now the leadership who is very wise and knows that bold steps should be taken to help our brothers in Africa to exchange. If not, we are all doomed to failure.
We have a few minutes left, but one of the files that cannot be ignored is education, because we have a serious issue with education in this continent. We have a high percentage of people that are uneducated, which is really a catastrophe in this day and age. And when you talk about wanting to develop the continent, how can you develop it when you have still large numbers of the new generation as well that is uneducated?
If African countries take care of education, the high standard of education in many domains, in many fields, not only general education, but technical one. And if Egypt will take care of Africa, Africa will be sure of it. Be sure of that. Africa will be the continent of the future. I'm sure of that. Why? As you said in the beginning, Africa is very rich continent. Very rich.
Yes. The
But
richest continent.
there is no organization. There is no any sort of discipline, no consciousness. And Africa was exploited in the last centuries in a very savage way.
Was?
Huh? Yeah.
I'm asking.
Yeah, and
it's a
I
was.
believe that it is high time to interfere to stop this massacre in Africa and try hard to raise the standard of living of the people, to improve the economy, and to give advice and help in the same time.
Dr. Cherif.
I agree, of course, that this continent has all the possibilities to succeed, and the opportunities are present now. It depends now on the future leadership in this continent and the collaboration. And I'm saying that it's very, maybe it was a hard past and a hard present also for this continent. But I think that things will be different in the future because with the presence of new forces like the Chinese and the Russians inside this continent, I think that the Europeans, the European era will end in this continent. The Chinese...
Will it end and be replaced, or will it end in our favor?
It has to be replaced by someone who would help this continent, because we cannot do it by ourselves. We have to have the will. But if the Chinese won't come and start building factories, for example, and investing, I don't think that the people in Africa are able to do it by themselves.
They are succeeding.
They are succeeding, and they're doing a great job. The Chinese are they are fair in what they're doing. They come, they take the territory, they take all the resources, and they give the government the money. And they tell them, you spend it on the people. They don't take the money and the materials and go back and tell them, well, see you in our country. No, they're not doing that. And I think that the Europeans are sensing that, and they are very, very keen not to bother the Chinese because it's an economic giant now. They know very well they're not in the same level like the Chinese. So there is a new economic and social, political era that is heading now in Africa, whether the forces, the international powers want it or not.
Role of women.
By the way, the U.S. administration is very nervous because of the Chinese success in Africa. Very nervous. And they're trying hard.
Well, they're nervous, but will they continue to stand watchful, or will they try to take a role?
And put in your consideration that Africa will be very near from the Silk Road, the Chinese Silk Road. So that's why the Americans are
watchful?
Yeah, nervous, very
angry.
angry.
Will they just be nervous and angry?
They cannot do anything.
They can't do it.
Why? Look, I was in Peking, the Chinese capital, and there was a summit of all about 48 head presidents of African countries. So I tried to ask some of them, why China? They said the two things I mentioned before, because they help us in the infrastructure and they give us help without any political conditions.
Yeah.
That was the answer, in short.
Well, gentlemen, the without conditions is really music to my ears, personally speaking. Gentlemen, I'd like to thank you both very much for your fruitful input, and maybe the positive note is that if we get our act together as Africans, definitely this couldn't be the continent of
the future, and it can be a force to be reckoned with, so to speak. Again, I thank you both for your fruitful input. I'd like to thank you, the viewers. Wish you a very pleasant evening, and we'll see you same time next week. Until then, good night.